All right, hello everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to the final session of our winter session program. I hope you found it rewarding so far. And now we're about to get into another really exciting session with Dr. Peter Baehr, whom I'm going to introduce to you shortly. So this talk is entitled The Unmasking Style in Social Theory. So it's a book talk. And Dr. Baehr examines the nature of unmasking in social theory, revolutionary movements, and popular culture. Unmasking is the practice of revealing the truth beneath by claiming to remove a disguise, and this can be aimed at groups or individuals. Dr. Baehr unpacks the intellectual origins of unmasking, how it has evolved, its techniques, such as microaggressions, and how it contributes to social polarization and bitterness of public discourse. So we're honored to have Dr. Baehr here with us this afternoon. He is the research professor in social theory at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Before coming to Hong Kong in 2000, he worked at universities in Canada and Britain. He teaches and writes mainly in the areas of social and political thought. Dr. Baehr's books include The Unmasking Style, which was published in 2019, so it's fresh off the press. Hannah Arendt's Totalitarianism and the Social Sciences, published in 2010. And Caesar and the Fading of the Roman World, which was published in 1998. Help me welcome Dr. Peter Baehr.
Well, thank you very much, students, for continuing on this great initiative, the Freedom Project, to have a winter session. And I imagine that after 3 or 4 days, you are sated with words. So I'm going to try and not be too long with this, because quite often discussion is better. But I want to kind of guide you through the issue of unmasking. Now, when I tell people that I've written a book on unmasking, I notice two prominent and immediate misconceptions about the book. First of all, people think that I'm advocating unmasking, that I think unmasking is a good thing, that it's an important power of theory that we should use it. But I'm not. I'm actually attacking unmasking. The second thing that people think when they hear the title of the book, The Unmasking Style, is that I'm chiefly concerned with unmasking lies, falsehoods. But I'm not. I can't contribute anything new to that. A lot of people have written about lying. There's a very good literature on it, actually. But the whole point about being a scholar is to do what other people don't do, right? And what you notice immediately when you become an academic is the sheer amount of repetition. Theory is a big problem here because people think they need a theory, and often they gravitate to the most seductive one. And then they simply recapitulate aspects of that theory through some kind of formula. That's not the way I consider theory. I think one should know theories, be educated about them, but use them lightly, and often in a hybrid way. So let me start then by talking about kind of a broad sketch of what I think unmasking is. But I want to say that getting to know the unmasking style is rather like getting to know a person. You know, if you think that we never get to know a person immediately, we get to know a person as a result of a number of encounters with that person. We build up a character profile of them, the kind of character we like or we don't like. And often our first impressions are wrong, often they're right. So I want to suggest to you that rather than some, slam dunk definition of unmasking, it's better to think about it of gradually becoming acquainted, familiar with the style, as you will do as you start to see more of its characteristics. Now I asked Karen to hand out some notes here, and I'm not going to read them obviously, but I just want to refer essentially to them as a way to guide you through my talk today. When I talk about the unmasking style, I'm talking about rhetorical techniques. I'm talking about the way that people speak and write. And I'm suggesting that there is a way of speaking and writing that degrades the cogency of ideas that the critic finds objectionable. Now, unmasking is not the same as criticism. Criticism is a very broad category. Unmasking is just one kind of criticism. Unmasking is not the same as scientific refutation. Scientific refutation, after all, requires the weighing of evidence. But unmaskers typically uninterested in weighing evidence. They're convinced that they know what the truth is. And if you are convinced that you know the truth, what more evidence do you need? It seems to me that whereas we often think that America and Britain and other countries are divided by what we believe, and that is true, it is also correct to say, and this is my area, that how we disagree is important as well. Over the course of the past few days, I understand, you've been looking at this as talking about civility and restraint, moderation. And I'm in this same kind of modality, you know. I'm looking at the problems that arise when we start to depict people using a certain kind of language and what that does to our ability to communicate with them properly. Where did this style come from? The style that I just summarized. You know, I could have said it's about stripping away false pretenses, about claiming that people are insincere, fraudulent, whatever. But where did that come from? It has a very long history. But I'm going to take up the history, or at least threads of the history, at around the time of the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, the most radical aspects of the revolutionaries, the Jacobin club and those who supported it, were infatuated with transparency. They were obsessed with the idea that we should be able to see through everything, this total legibility of human conduct. Because if you didn't, how could you tell that a person who claimed to believe in and defend the new republic was not actually a closet aristocrat? How could you know that? So there was a large vocabulary developed about the importance of sincerity and honesty and truthfulness. But revolutionaries are suspicious people. They find conspiracies everywhere. And as a result, they started unmasking those people who they felt perhaps were not true believers. And unmasking, démasquant, I mean, this was the term they actually used, was extensively used during this revolutionary period. We have to recall that the Jacobins, the revolutionary leaders more generally, were journalists and lawyers, so they were good with words. And eventually, and it didn't take too long, a whole casuistry of terms and distinctions developed around unmasking. Between, for example, unmasking and informing, denunciation and informing. Some parts were good, some parts were bad. It became more and more confusing and blurred. And you know the history of the revolution. You know that the revolutionaries drowned their own revolution in blood and ended up destroying themselves. That's where unmasking leads, when it is unloosed. So that is a cautionary tale about what happens when unmasking is not just something of the academic seminar, but when it is actually used in practice. It is very, very dangerous. Once the unmasking language was unloosed. It started to spread, even after the revolution, and after the revolution was defeated. It was picked up by academics, it was picked up by radicals like Marx, who uses the term and kind of reworks it. I may come back to that. And then we see another major manifestation of it in the Russian Revolution. There were two revolutions in Russia. I'm not even sure, revolution is the way they're described, but they're really not the right terms in some sense. The 1905 revolution, so-called, actually failed. It was a more kind of liberal bourgeois revolution. The 1917 revolution was really a coup d'etat by the Bolsheviks, by a radical sect of Marxists. And even before the Bolsheviks took over power, they were using this unmasking language, and they developed it extensively. The French revolutionaries had used the term enemies of the people. Dangerous term. I'm going to come back to it in a moment. The Bolsheviks took up the term again. But here there was a slight difference, because when the Bolsheviks started to talk about enemies of the people and objective enemies, what mattered was not what a person did. It mattered who you are. Right? It was a status description. So if you had come from, if you were a reformer or you associated with a noble, a priest, a kulak, or others, by virtue of that association, you were an enemy. You were a class enemy. Anybody who was not a proletarian was an enemy. And paradoxically, what this led to was extensive masking. People had to hide their pasts. They had to hide their identities, because in order to get a job in the new Russian state, you had to fill out a form, a biography. So people would adapt it to make sure they didn't fall under one of these anathematized categories. And then, I'm sure that a number of you will know what happened in the early part of the revolution. Stalin takes over, you have the show trials, you have mass purges, you have people, you have denunciations, you have false confessions, you have hundreds of thousands of people being sent off to labor camps, never coming back. If you were the wife, or the daughter, or the son, or the husband of somebody who had been convicted, your life was over. You'd probably be put in a different camp. The language of unmasking, again, was used extensively in Russian. So I'm not ventriloquizing the Bolsheviks. I'm not assigning to them a term that they didn't have. They had this term, they used it. Well, there's a lot more about this history that I could say, but I think you've probably heard enough of it. And you'll probably want to know more about the techniques of unmasking and perhaps some of the applications of this today. So let me get on to that. A problem of any concept, I'm sure you've found this already, is that if you use it too generally, if you use it too broadly, it starts to lose its powers of explanation. So you've got to try and be precise about the terms and the concepts you use. Generic concepts, it's too easy with those just to lasso a whole variety of different kinds of things. And the most important skill to learn as a student, in my view, especially a student interested in politics, is the ability to make distinctions. distinctions. The biggest problems arise when people conflate what are actually different things. And it should be the job of scholars to help students make these distinctions. But most things do need to be unpacked. And when you unpack them, you often find that actually what you might have thought you were talking about one single thing, you were talking about a number of different things, and these things do not fit. And being aware of that means that we then try to be rigorous. So, not everything is unmasking. To criticize another person is not unmasking necessarily. But there are certain techniques of unmasking, and it's these techniques that I've tried to focus on and explore. And I'm going to mention them now. I'll go through them fairly quickly. Remember, when we're talking about unmasking, we're talking about practices or techniques that dismiss, degrade other people's ideas without arguing with them. You don't need arguing, you don't need debate. What a person says is a trigger for your action. And these actions are also techniques, because a technique is a practice. The first one I want to point out is weaponization. This is the most violent technique of unmasking, and we saw a lot of it in revolutions. Weaponization, in the sense I'm using it here, is the employment of an intemperate language in which persons, groups, and ideas are condemned as evil or inhuman. The Nazis unmasked Jews as vermin, and Islamists in the Middle East and elsewhere do the same. Now, you might think that university intellectuals would steer clear of such excessive accusation, but not at all. They gain kudos from doing so. Look no further than Rutgers University women's studies professor, Yasbir Puar, a prize-winning writer and a star of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. The title of her book, The Right to Maim, abbreviates her inflammatory assertion that it is Israeli policy to shoot Palestinians to disfigure rather than kill them. That Israel has embarked on a policy of harvesting the organs of Palestinians. And that Israel deprives living Palestinians of nutrients so their children will grow up stunted. Now, it is of course true that intemperate speech is a fixture of politics more generally today. Donald Trump has described the press as enemies of the people, and Democratic politicians as traitors and lowlife. During the last general election, when Trump was competing against Hillary Clinton, lock her up was one of the uglier chants in pro-Trump rallies. But Donald Trump's opponents are no better. In fact, they are worse because they claim to be better. Since his inauguration, Trump's critics in liberal media, Hollywood, and Congress have refused to accept Trump's electoral legitimacy, have dubbed his regime fascist, have depicted his supporters as morons, and have fantasized in public about hitting, decapitating, or in other ways murdering the president. Maxine Waters, a congresswoman, has called Trump a demon. Duke University professor Alan Francis adds for good measure that because of his indifference to climate change, President Trump is as destructive a person in the century as Stalin, Hitler, and Mao were in theirs. At the very least, this lacks a sense of proportion. That is what an education should be providing. The second technique of unmasking is perhaps the most devastating. It's most devastating for the person who is the recipient. Calling it inversion. Inversion is the practice of taking a person's words as evidence of interests or beliefs diametrically opposed to those professed by that person. What does that mean? Well, for example, in Germany, in the 1930s, it was common for communists to call their rivals fascists, an inversion of the truth that catastrophically helped the Nazis win power. Unmasking inversion is even more familiar today. You say that there are sound reasons to be concerned about the impact of rapid mass immigration on resident communities. I say that you are a xenophobe. You say that you are indifferent to a person's color. I say such indifference is itself a covert form of racism. We end in deadlock because no persuasive denial of these accusations is possible. In fact, to deny an unmasking accusation is to look as if one is in denial. Students, I suggest to you that such inversion and other unmasking techniques gloss over the most striking features of human relationships, namely their ambiguity and their complexity. As we steer through life, it is rarely clear where we and others are going, how a particular problem should be solved, and whether we're the best people to solve it. Time and again, pundits make predictions with great certainty. Time and again, events prove the pundits wrong. The limits of our knowledge and control of others and ourselves, even in the smallest matters of life, should astonish and chasten us. All this suggests that we should doubt the certainty, the formulaic reduction that unmasking writers bring to their topics. And we should doubt our own certainty when we too succumb to dogmatism. The third technique is reduction and positioning. Instead of evaluating the content of a concept or an argument and judging it on its merits, reduction and positioning suffices to gesture from where the concept or argument came from. Classical Marxism disliked whatever it disliked as bourgeois. If you said something was bourgeois, that was the end of it. Right? Social movements do something similar with the term Jew and white. Post-colonial social thought is shot through with positioning. An example is the sociologist Julian Go's claim that I'm quoting him now. The so-called structure-agency problem reflects the standpoint of the power of metropolitan societies. Julian Go believes that wherever this dualism, structure-agency, wherever this dualism is applied beyond northern boundaries, it amounts, I'm quoting him again, to the analytical version of imperial opposition, unquote. So at a stroke, ontological reflection is tarred with domination by the unmasker. Readers are not shown how or why the structure-agency distinction is problematic, which I should think it is, but problematic in its own terms. It suffices to position it as metrocentric. If you position it that way, end of discussion. More generally, unmasking is invariably reductionist. Politics is reduced to economics. Religion is reduced to psychology. Morality is reduced to power, and so forth. A fourth technique is deflation. Deflation is a practice in which a person or an idea is considered to suffer from some sociological, from some social or psychological debility that again makes any argument with them unnecessary. One of the oldest deflations is to describe a person's views as an illusion. And this term illusion is ubiquitous. It's one of the most common ways in which we dismiss other people's ideas. Recurrently in social and political discussion, illusion and delusion are ways of sorting society into more refined and less refined minds. Marx said that liberalism was an illusion. Lord Acton said that Marxism was an illusion. François Furet, the great French historian, talked about the illusion of communism. It turns out that in social and political thought and argument, illusion is just a value judgment posing as a factual statement. It's one of those terms we shouldn't use, because almost every idea you can think of has been called an illusion by somebody or by some group. Now, that does not mean that the concept of illusion itself is not a good concept. It does, but here we come back to the importance of making distinctions. In the science of optics, we can really talk about illusions. Illusions are real. One can actually see illusions. Scientists can also contrive illusions. Similarly, in some branches of psychology, we can also consider that delusion is real. My name is Peter Baehr, and I'm a human. But if I was to imagine that I was actually a grizzly bear, then we would say with certainty that man is seriously ill. Okay, so it's not that illusion or delusion are bad concepts in themselves. They become problematic when they're extrapolated to the social and political world and argument. That's an old deflationary tactic to describe a view as an illusion. A more modern one, and something that you'll also be very familiar with, you may actually use it yourself, is evident in the proliferation of terms that end in phobic, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, ecophobic, and several others in a steadily expanding list. Strictly speaking, when you think about it, this language is redundant. We have other terms to express intolerance. Terms like bigotry, prejudice, narrow-mindedness, and so forth. Phobia, in contrast, has connotations that are distinctly medical and therapeutic. Phobic language unmasks because it translates one set of statements, for instance on immigration, into another that negates the sincerity or rationality of the first set of statements. It transforms an account that expresses a political or moral argument into a social sickness caused by toxic motives or interests. And it's striking to me more generally that an ever more common way of denouncing political opponents, the current president included, is to claim that they are unhinged or even mad. I'm now coming towards the end of my list of techniques. I have a number, but I'm only going to give you a sample of them. This one I'll call elongation. Elongation refers to the practice of stretching a concept potentially to infinity. The concept in question loses its boundaries loses its limits. A prominent example of this that I'll use today is the rhetoric of racialization. The notion that racism and white supremacism or white privilege are ubiquitous in American society. Now let's take this one on, right, directly. It's a commonplace today on the American left, as much a premise of critical race studies as it is of the New York Times 1619 project, that the American Republic's foundational ideas of liberty and equality are frauds. In Democracy in America, the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville, traveling to America in the 1840s, could marvel at the Republic's practices of freedom and equality, never before seen anywhere else in the world, while at the very same time condemning as evils the existence of slavery and the dispossession of native Indians. I don't know whether you've read Democracy in America, but the longest chapter is on the Indians, or what happened to them. It's an absolutely heartbreaking analysis. He also has chapters on slavery, but the largest chapter on the book, in the book, is devoted to the expropriation of native Indians. But here's the thing. The kind of distinction that Tocqueville made, which was that liberty and equality are real and remarkable and unprecedented in America. But at the same time, there are aspects of American society which are evil. That kind of distinction is unfashionable today. Instead, we are told that every aspect of American history and society, both past and now, is tainted by the experience of slavery. While Tocqueville offered nuance, observing that the good and the bad coexist, but are also irreducible to each other, we demand a single key to history. And for many intellectuals, as distinct from ordinary people, that key is race. But is it race? And is it racism? Few people will doubt that a system as wicked as slavery has had manifold consequences for America. And some of these consequences are evident today. But to describe every aspect of American society as affected by slavery is like saying that every aspect of American society is affected by the legacy of religion, or by westward expansion, or by the power of the greenback, or by the fact that the geography of the United States constrains it to be both a Pacific and an Atlantic power. I come back to a point I made earlier, which is that a concept that embraces everything fails to explain anything in particular. Racialization is this elongation concept that I've been describing as unmasking in practice. And by it, just let me repeat, I mean the ever-expanding list of conducts and attitudes to which the accusation of racism is applied. Inevitably, this spills over to the cognate claim about white supremacism and white privilege. Well, I'd remind you that this kind of allegation has chilling historical analogues. The most notorious is the Nazi idea of the Judaism of thought, so-called Jewish intellectualization. As David Narenberg points out in his book Anti-Judaism, the Nazis boasted many intellectuals among their supporters. Joseph Goebbels, for instance, the Reich's propaganda minister, had a PhD in German literature. But Nazi doctrine wasn't interested in real Jews, in actual Jews. What particular Jews did, how particular Jews lived. Jewishness, or Judaism, was, like whiteness today apparently, a kind of demonic ether or spirit that emanated from Judaism and saturated an entire society with its poison. Judaism stretched to the arts, to history of ideas, to linguistics, to physics, and of course biology. I submit to you today that the accusation of generic white supremacism or generic white privilege is the same kind of claim. It attaches white privilege, not simple white supremacism, let's say, not simply to neo-Nazi gangs who openly brag of supremacist ambitions, but to white people in general, regardless of what white people do, what they believe, and how they live. Much like Judaism in the abstract, there is something about whiteness that appears metaphysically depraved. It should be obvious that what I'm calling racialization, this stretching, this elongation of the concept of racism, has an obvious polemical advantage for the people who espouse it. To insist that America is integrally racist, rather than contingently or intermittently racist, is to suggest that any counter-argument advanced by a white person is tainted with racism. That's the unmasking mood. Now, admittedly, this dance runs into some embarrassment when the critic is black. But then, following the logic of racialization, a black person who refutes racialization may be deemed spiritually white, and Uncle Tom. Racialization has a severe weakness. The more blankly that racism is alleged, the less it appears credible, especially to ordinary people. In consequence, racism, a real wrong, deserving serious attention, becomes trivialized by racialization, as an avalanche of petty complaints overwhelm urgent ones in need of redress. Besides, ask yourself what the accusation of pervasive white privilege is supposed to achieve among white people. Is it going to persuade them? You're kidding, right? No one is persuaded by being insulted. Would it encourage conciliation? I doubt it. Indignation is the more likely response. What about solidarity? Will this charge of ubiquitous white privilege, will it encourage solidarity? Well, that's very unlikely, because solidarity, unlike pity, is a two-way street. It cannot exist where one party sits above the other in patronizing or censorious judgment. I conjecture that for most white people, the notion that whiteness is a matter to be problematized, to use the jargon of critical race studies, or that whiteness is a privilege in itself, is nothing more than a racist slur, because it attaches privilege and a problem to a color, and not to a real person, or to an actual condition or activity. Now, there are others that I could mention, other techniques, but I don't want to go into too many more. I think that I've got across the most important. And I looked at race in particular as an example because I know that Americans, particularly highly liberal Americans, particularly Americans like the students who come here, are constantly talking about race. So I wanted to go into that. I wanted to give it some direct attention. Now, let me try and end. just give me about 5 more minutes, and then we can stop. Obviously, I've got a lot more to say, but less is better. I've been looking at a variety of what I'm calling unmasking techniques, which are ways of rubbishing people's arguments. The idea that there can be principled disagreement is obliterated by the unmasker. There is no such thing as principled disagreement. There is right and there is wrong. in both an epistemological and a moral sense. I've been suggesting that unmasking truncates our sympathies, it abridges our understanding, and it degrades our tolerance of disagreement. The interesting thing to me about unmasking is that it is not confined to academic theory or to the left. The right also unmasks. Everybody is doing it. That's the problem. And no group is immune from unmasking, particularly its perpetrators. Denouncers are denounced. Self-righteousness breeds more answering self-righteousness. The circle of exposure is unbroken. Feminism, for instance, is awash in unmasking practices. But these are aimed not just at men. As one woman writer says, subjective intentions are of no account when accused of an intersectional crime. If you offend someone, a self-described victim, and then try to explain that you were misunderstood, this is seen as compounding the original injury. For some of the accused, of whatever gender, self-abasement is considered the only appropriate response to a heresy that was never intended and is now bitterly regretted. I am listening closely and I am reflecting deeply. I am sorry for the pain I have caused. Treading anywhere close to blackface is horrifying to me, and I am profoundly regretful. The fact that I did not foresee this reading of the poem is humbling and eye-opening. I am beginning the process of talking to people and re-evaluating what it means to make art in this world from a place of privilege. These words from a young white American poet, Anders Carlson, who had written sympathetically about the plight of the homeless, only to be accused of racism and ableism, turn an apology into a confession, and a confession into a promise to reform. The format is a postmodern identity update of a standard Stalinist script. But the consequences of unmasking do not stop at individual humiliation. They have political consequences as well, and I'm going to end on this. In his book, Achieving Our Country, Leftist Thought in 20th Century America, the philosopher Richard Rorty contrasts earlier reformists who wish to change laws and make America a more decent place to live in, with writers he dubs the spectorial left, for whom America is an object of disgust. For left anti-communist reformists like Herbert Crowley and John Dewey and Arthur Schlesinger and Sidney Hook and Irving Howe and Lionel Trilling, America was a great republic whose promise was yet to be redeemed. The mission of the left to this reformist group was to be a party of hope, as Rorty puts it, working to improve America by removing impediments to equal opportunity, justice, and prosperity for all. For the spectorial left, however, America is a name for an ongoing fraud. It is not worthy of reform. It requires the unremitting exposure of hypocrisy and self-deception. Michel Foucault, Martin Heidegger, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan are the heroes of this new cultural progressivism. Whereas the older reformist political left sought to identify particular injustices and change them through law, the new spectorial left has an essentially Gothic view of society. It sees power everywhere, suffusing all spaces, bodies as well as minds, a preternatural spectral force that can never be defeated only interrogated, to use a favorite word. Confronting power for the spectorial left does not mean addressing harmful practices and putting forward concrete alternatives and then mobilizing support for them. Confronting power means critique, a thorough unmasking of the system. A leftist himself, Richard Rorty bitterly laments the cultural left's dereliction. Its solipsistic self-importance, he protests, is anti-political. Contemptuous of its own society, it has severed connection to the American working classes that the left was born to defend. American workers are patriotic. They are often religiously minded. They welcome reforms provided they anticipate beneficial results from them. American workers do not welcome being dismissed as gun-toting, homophobic bigots. The cultural left's disdainful tone and rebarbative language is not a policy. It is an open invitation for other political forces to move into abandoned terrain. This book was published in 1998, shortly before Rorty died. In the book, he predicted that in the absence of reformist leadership on the American left, it was just a matter of time before American workers looked elsewhere for inspiration and solidarity. A strong man to take on that role, he warned, might be waiting in the wings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baehr. Let's get into the Q&A right away so that we can unpack all these really exciting ideas that Dr. Baehr just put forward. I can answer the question.
Sure.
So you gave a historical sketch of the fact that this goes as far back as the 1789 revolution,
yes,
and the Russian Revolution. And history has a tendency to repeat itself. So I'm curious to know, why are we in this contemporary era of increased unmasking in the United States? I know that some commentators would like to attribute it to President Trump, and that's something that I disagree with. I think it's much bigger than just one individual. So what explains this historical moment? What explains the increased unmasking in this historical moment?
Well, really what we're seeing is a culmination of a process. Unmasking has been going on ever since the French Revolution. But it has become far, far worse with the emergence of identity politics. Because identity politics means that you don't have to argue with anybody. You can claim to be a victim, part of a victim category. That's the end of it. People don't want to argue against people who think of themselves as victims. You kill the discussion. And identity politics is also vociferous, meaning, in other words, that it fragments. There's so much of it. Anybody can claim a sacred identity and demand a special status for it. So if you do that, a person from that position can unmask anything coming to them, any argument or what have you. Now, admittedly, identity politics is not the be-all and end-all. President Trump is not an identity politician. Tucker Carlson isn't. But Tucker Carlson uses unmasking tropes. One of the things that he says on his show, which I watch and enjoy, is that the left projects its own biases, its own prejudices on others. So when it accuses others of being obsessed with racism, actually that's the left's obsession. When it claims that others are involved in conspiracy, the left itself is involved in conspiracy theorizing. Now, I'm not particularly happy with that kind of argument because I think it is an unmasking one. But
the point is that everybody can use it. And so we get back, I guess, to what you've been doing in earlier parts of this course, this winter session course, is to think of ways of arguing with people without unmasking them. And one of the ways that you can do that is not to use unmasking language. If we don't use unmasking language, we have to argue differently. And I think that can help us. Could I add one other thing? The book that I'm drawing on here, The Unmasking Style in Social Theory, is the subject of a couple of symposia in journals. And one is for the American sociologists, and it's quite a big group of people. And one of the writers says that a problem about Peter Baehr's book is that he has no answer to unmasking. And my answer to that is exactly. Because there is no answer to unmasking. There is only a way of us behaving towards it. Unmasking is so deeply rooted now in modern society and modern culture. It's so enjoyable. It's so tempting. You are never, ever going to root it out. There's no policies, there's nothing. And so here we come down to a very humanistic thing. The only thing that can impede unmasking is that if you refuse to unmask. Now there are ways that you can fortify yourself. There are methods. There are resources. I can mention that later if you like. But there's no answer to it. There's no end to it. We don't control society. We don't even control ourselves. We don't even control the smallest part of life. So there is no answer to unmasking. But we can understand it, and we can think individually of what not to do if we want to avoid unmasking. Yeah.
I would have to go to a meeting, as you know, but you mentioned the word transparency. And that's such a positive word in general social discussion today. Could you expand a little bit on the connection between demands for transparency or lauding of transparency and the ubiquity of unmasking?
Yes. Let me just start from an assertion, feel free to dispute it, which is that nothing is transparent, least of all ourselves. That a great challenge of life is that it is so opaque. It's opaque for so many reasons. The world is so complicated. Our relationships are complicated. We're changing. Transparency is like kind of a snapshot, an X-ray of a person, but that's just not real when it's referring to our emotions or how we think. But transparency is really important for unmaskers because they have this image of the mask, right? And the image is of, now you see it, now you don't. Before, after. It's a kind of a dualistic thing. So the idea is that people are fairly simple, and you can find a way of getting to the root of who they are by unmasking them. I think epistemologically, as a theory of knowledge or as a theory of how we are, that seems to me to be so naive.
Questions?
Please.
Is there a danger that in looking out for unmasking tendencies and unmasking behaviors that you'll yourself engage in some sort of unmasking, that that you'll miss real people behind real arguments and concerns that you might otherwise engage with more substantively?
Well, there's always the danger that our own biases and our threshold of tolerance for other people's views can blind us to good ideas that they have that we're not seeing. And so I think you're right that there is a danger of looking out for unmasking everywhere, which will just make us distrustful. And that's a bad thing. We don't want that. But I don't think that what I'm doing is unmasking, because I would be, in my book I look at a number of writers, including unmasking writers, who are very popular. For example, Pierre Bourdieu, the demigod of modern sociology, and much else. Classic unmasking thinker. But when I criticize Bourdieu, I don't unmask him. I don't try and invert what he said. I don't weaponize my arguments against him. I don't claim that he's living under an illusion. A writer like Marx, who really helps, first of all, solidify theoretically the unmasking template, actually uses the term inversion extensively in his writings on religion and in Das Kapital. And for him, it's a good thing. Inversion is what we need. So this is why I said earlier, I won't ventriloquize writers, imposing my own language on them. I'm trying to reflect on their language, on their images, on their topoi and others, and to spin out from that an understanding of what they're doing.
And so I want to turn to the point about satire.
Yeah.
I guess from this point you're arguing that what Ricky Gervais did, maybe to some extent Dave Chappelle did, calling out some of these contemporary practices, is the unmasking of the book. Could you please speak more on that? And also, could you comment on whether this will set some kind of a precedence in the arts, that there'll be more and more satirical works that reflect some of these contemporary unmasking practices?
Can I say something about satire first?
Yes.
Is satire unmasking? It looks a bit like it. But I think that there is a major difference between satire and what I would call theoretical unmasking, the unmasking done by people like Pierre Bourdieu or Karl Marx or Adorno or others. And the difference is that the satirists, the great satirists that we think of, like Jonathan Swift and others, what they're pointing to is the primal folly of human beings. That we're all basically nuts and just trying to put things together. Life is ridiculous, and we're ridiculous with it. There's no emancipation, forget that. And so the whole point about satire is to remind us of our limitations, to wean us of our pride that we can reconstruct the human race according to a model. And so in that way, it's very anti-unmasking in a curious way. It punctures authority, but it doesn't make the grand claims for emancipation and what have you. Now, as far as the Ricky Gervais incident, you're referring here to his comments in the Golden Globes. Well, what was so unusual about that was that a a person in that setting called out those who are so privileged that they seem to have lost all contact with people outside the lovies, as the English call them. That little group of people who they communicate with and who affirm them and give them prizes. And what he said was, you're hypocrites. You know nothing about the world, and you're largely stupid to boot. Now the thing is that fair? Is that true? I make no judgment about that. But it was powerful, because in that setting, where it is just a ritual of self-congratulation, Ricky Gervais took the whole lot on, and that had a lot of power. Let me give you another example, which I think is somewhat better. Lawrence Fox is a man you might not know. He's a British actor, and he was recently on Question Time, which is a BBC program where famous people come on stage and the audience asks them questions. And inevitably, the issue of Meghan Markle came up, and Harry. And somebody in the audience asked a question rather like, well, you know, do you think that she was repelled by racism? And Lawrence Fox's answer was really quite interesting here, because he said, why do you think racism has got anything to do with it? Most British people didn't even know, wouldn't even have realized that Meghan Markle was mixed race, unless the BBC or the Guardian hadn't made such a big deal of it. They welcomed her. When they found out she was moving, they welcomed her. They thought it was a modernizing of the monarchy. But then, from the audience, a female academic stood up and said, well, you know, you're speaking from a standpoint of white privilege. And he pushed back on it. He said, no, I'm speaking truth to nonsense. And he said, the issue about racism is a very serious one in Britain right now. And he spelled it out. And again, most people wouldn't have done this. Now, I don't know whether you know, but over the last few years, there has been a rising scandal about the grooming of young girls, chiefly white girls, by Pakistani men. And this has happened in Rotherham, most recently in Manchester. And girls, sometimes at the age of 12 and 13, have been groomed by these gangs, South Asian men, and basically prostituted. Now, the girls themselves are in a pitied state. There's no social order in their own households. Some of them are waifs and strays. They're really vulnerable people. And they've been preyed on by these men. They don't prey on Asian girls. They prey on these girls. And this happened for quite some time. The social workers and the police were too nervous to actually name it, for fear of being called racist. And so their unwillingness to talk honestly about something that was associated with a race or a culture meant that these girls were put in the most awful, wicked situation. Their lives ruined. And it was only later, by some brave people, some brave social workers and others, who blew the whistle on the whole thing. Now, Lawrence Fox says, you know, you talk about racism, and Marco, you were talking about one of the most privileged people in the world. I mean, she has nothing to worry about. Not in terms of racism, but there was racism occurring in England. The racism being practiced by these men against young white girls. And where were you then? Where were you then to protest it? So I think that the main thing that comes out of the Ricky Gervais and the Lawrence Fox It's not that we agree with all they say. I find some of Germain's stuff absolutely repugnant. But that there comes a time when people feel they need to be truthful, and it can have a major impact. For example, this BBC Question Time, it occurred live. And this week, it was in Liverpool. Liverpool is a very left-wing place. Very, very left-wing. And when that woman academic referred to Lawrence Fox as speaking from white privilege, the audience groaned. The audience groaned. Now that's a warning. And the warning is that people are running out of patience with this sort of stuff. And I think that, you know, you guys must be thinking about this in relation to the coming election. Because a lot of this is very relevant. Are your candidates, is a candidate like Elizabeth Warren, who is an ultra-woke candidate, is she going to be able to win? Not because she's a woman, but because there was never a woke cause she saw that she didn't appropriate. Are the Americans outside of here and elsewhere, are they going to buy that? Probably not. Bernie Sanders they might buy. They'll say Bernie's consistent. He's been saying the same thing for 40 years. He's done nothing, but he's consistent. And the comment about his apparent sexism is also, I think, rather ambiguous here, don't you think? Let's say that it's true 2 years ago. He said that a woman couldn't become president of the United States. Let's just say that was true. It's not necessarily a sexist comment. It doesn't mean, I mean, I just don't know, but it doesn't necessarily mean I don't think you should become president, or a woman should become president. It means I don't think Americans will elect an American woman. Now, he may be wrong about it, but it doesn't necessarily make him sexist. He'd only be sexist, wouldn't he, if he actually believed that Americans shouldn't. So you could see it as simply an empirical claim. Now then we have the problem that many years later he's on campus saying that a woman could be president of the United States. So we have a he said, she said issue, which doesn't get us very far.
Oh.
I was noticing that towards the end you started making a lot of empirical claims that I'm not sure I necessarily agree with, but using sort of the logic that you used just now, and I totally agree with you that that statement, a woman couldn't be president, could just really be an empirical claim and doesn't necessarily have to be sexist. You could apply that to the example that you gave of the South Asian men who were grooming these white girls. Like, what if they're just pedophiles, or what if they're like it could have potentially had nothing to do with race. So I think the analysis that you're making seems a little bit biased towards one side, is what I would say. And also, I think the empirical claim that Meghan Markle was very welcomed in Britain. I think that there are a lot of news headlines and a lot of experiences that she's had that really would refute that. Like, I've seen videos where people are comparing her to, or calling, or saying, I think there were a lot of people who were saying that their kid is going to look like a chimpanzee. She's being blamed for her and Harry leaving. I mean, I don't follow them too much, so I don't know a lot about that, but I think that flat out saying like Meghan Markle hasn't experienced racism is, I think, really tough to say, and you made the claim that people wouldn't even have known if BBC hadn't put it out, but I think it's very clear that Meghan Markle doesn't look like Kate Middleton. I think that people could have easily figured out that she's not white, and so I just question those things.
You know, you're right, and I overgeneralize. Let me put it. Let me try and make the distinctions that I've been suggesting that we all should make. And thank you for making the point. Meghan Markle started to fall out with the British public, or the British public fall out with her after the wedding, when she started to resume her life as a kind of Hollywood-type celebrity. And the English people welcomed her before. But the more she became a kind of a Hollywood type of person, the more they stopped welcoming her, and the more that they stopped liking her. And they felt that her conduct was not dignified, and it didn't fit with the kind of regimen that is required of a royal. Now, I would agree that this is quite ironic in some ways, since royals have often behaved in the most appalling and undignified ways. And it is also true that the press, the British tabloid press in particular, became very aggressive towards him. They became even more aggressive when, after having their child, Archie, they didn't want to show Archie to the press and so on. But you're right, and I did overspeak, because there was hostility towards her. Now, the thing about chimpanzee, I mean, that is way, way, way off. I mean, there are empirically, I don't know how one quantifies people who would think in those terms. But my experience of the British is that generally the British people are very, very tolerant people and very welcoming people. And people who said things like that would not be received well by most British people. But anyway, thank you for that correction. Now, the issue of the grooming gangs, I can't agree with you. This was not a matter of episodic, arbitrary pedophilia. This was a group of Asian men, a gang. There were several of them in different cities, and they chose white girls. They chose white girls. So there was a racial component in it for sure. I mean, I don't see how you can get beyond it. Now, do white men prey on waifs and strays? Some do, for sure. But the case we're talking about is a different case. It's a case of a gang, or rather several gangs in several different cities, and the inability of police and social workers to know how to respond to them. And I think that it is without question that if those men had been white, the police would have come down on them immediately, and social workers would have reported them. So on Markle, I agree with you, but on the grooming gangs, I don't. Yes?
I was going to say, could you clarify what you mean by the British are tolerant people? And like what kind of tolerance you're encompassing in that?
Well, in what way are they intolerant?
I suppose from a personal example, I don't think they're particularly welcoming to Poles. I think there's a long history of British discrimination against the Polish people, and that's within a European context, not to speak on other citizens of other countries. And I think, I'm both Polish and American, and it has always been advised to me to introduce myself as American when in England. And I think they're very tired of being a settlement for the Polish diaspora. And I think as much as like discrimination in the US exists, I think it's a lot harsher. Discrimination towards Polish people in the US exists, I think it's a lot harsher in the UK.
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's true that a lot of people from Central Europe have not felt particularly welcome in Britain. So does that mean the British aren't tolerant? Well, I suppose it depends what you mean by tolerant.
I guess that's what I was
I
asking.
think that there is a difference between being welcoming and between being tolerant. And I haven't lived in England for quite some time. I live in Hong Kong. But when we talk about the Poles, the relationship with the British is actually quite complicated with the Poles. Because historically, there is a very big bond between them because of the Second World War. And I think the issue about Poles in England was that the whole immigration system was felt to be out of control, which it was. And therefore groups of people who settled in a system that was deemed chaotic were not welcomed, or were not welcomed as much as they otherwise would be with a system that is more ordered. I mean, for example, in Canada, there is basically a point system. Immigration is controlled. People come in, but in relatively small numbers. And also, they come in according to the level of skill that they have. And then there is a quota for refugees. A country like Canada can handle that. Britain is a very small country, a very congested country. And so when in a short period of time, immigrants from any society come in, that is going to raise difficulties for the native population. So, welcome, not always, maybe not, maybe, I don't know. You're a Pole, maybe you've probably got a lot more anecdotal information than I have. But tolerance, I would say yes. You didn't see any riots against Polish people. You didn't see bakeries being burnt down. You didn't see people leaving their houses because they had Polish neighbors. And one of the classic things that is often said about the British is that the British people have very strong prejudices in general, except when they meet somebody face to face. Now, all these are generalizations. We're speaking in generalizations. We're going to find exceptions to them. And that would be my response.
So I have another question. I'm curious to know, to what extent would you say that unmasking and these manifestations is connected to maybe questions of the distribution of public goods, or questions of access to material gain, or other existential issues? Is it particularly dominant in the realm of discourse and difference, or in some way it reflects underlying struggles for access to wherewithal that supports whatever life?
I don't really know. I haven't really thought through that. I think it's largely a discursive thing. I don't know how it relates to public goods. I think you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, I couldn't know how to formulate it, that's why I
That's
tried
right.
as my case.
That's okay, go on.
I have two questions actually. It seems like that you formulated everything on a negative perception of the definition of the situations, right? How social theory defines everything. Were some way related to unmasking.
No, not all social theory.
Not all social
Oh, no,
theory.
no, no.
You used a lot of examples from the left
Yeah,
in social theory
Absolutely.
and Trump,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But nothing in between.
Okay.
So, do you have any examples from other kinds of other like social theory maybe that position themselves in other side of the political spectrum?
Oh, yeah.
Anything, is there anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. In the book, I say that actually most of sociological theory is not unmasking, is not. So unmasking is just a subtype of social theory. And it is very prominent on the left. I mean, social theory doesn't have right-wing or conservative writers for the most part. I can think of hardly any in sociology. I'm probably the most conservative. Andrew Adam, University of Chicago. Maybe Jonathan Imber. But there are a few. There are a few. But in general, sociological theorists do not unmask. They don't accuse, they don't invert, they don't claim that people's views are as well a result of illusion, and so forth. They try and explain. And something that is the best pushback on unmasking in social theory is ethnography, the ethnographic method, the method that anthropologists and others use. Ethnography means to have a close study of those whom you are investigating, getting to know their world and how their world makes sense to them, getting to know the situational rationality that governs people's lives, not some abstract philosophical rationality, but the situational rationality, why things make sense to Trump supporters, for instance, why things make sense to evangelicals and others. I'm mentioning these because these are typically the pariahs of the left. They're the people who can't understand, they want to understand, they would rather dismiss them. So ethnography as a method is radically anti-unmasking. The whole job is not to unmask, but to understand. And another aspect of culture, which is anti-unmasking, I think, is the novel. Moving away from social theory now. Because think about the novels that you read. They will tend to reveal, to come back to this word, human complexity. Unmaskers tend to think that there is one motive that you can find in somebody. And if you can expose it, you've got to the core of their being. But novelists don't think like that. In a novel, there are a number of characters whose motives often become more complicated and more opaque, and they're changing, and they're interacting with others. When many of the novelists talk about writing a novel, they'll often say they're not sure where the novel is going. They're not sure what characters will be like. There are many characters, for example, in the work of George Eliot and Jane Austen, who start off as really objectionable, horrible characters, and we later find out that they're not. So the novel is the most unmasking, I think, of all idioms. And it's there that I think we really find out about human complexity and opacity. I really think that social theory doesn't do that very well at all.
Can I add something? About your concluding comment on critique of unmasking necessarily not being an unmasking critic itself. I understand that this is in the limits of a presentation, so please correct me if I got it wrong, but when you say maybe feminism is awash with unmasking practices and style, isn't this also sort of elongation, to use your definition, to totalize, feminism as one brand,
No, not at all. I said it was a wash, but I mean, I didn't say that all feminists are actually unmasking or unmaskers. There are a number of feminists who oppose it. I mean, Elizabeth Badinter, for example, or Daphne Patai. There are many feminists who are actually saying similar things to me and who are rejecting what has actually happened to broad swathes of feminism, particularly in the academy. Not so much outside of it. Outside of the academy, most women wear feminism fairly lightly. But in the academy, it becomes heavily theorized. So, I mean, I was quoting from The Nation, which is not a right-wing magazine. So I think feminism, academic feminism, is deeply mired in unmasking, deeply mired. English departments in particular. So, yeah.
You say the social theory doesn't unmask the truth. Do you think, or what's your opinion about the so do you think the social theory doesn't unmask due to its nature or its lack of ability to?
But I've been saying that large parts of social theory do unmask.
Sorry, I was thinking that. Okay, anyway, so I can rephrase my question and then I can ask again. So.
Yeah. Okay.
I have another question. So, as you're speaking, I started thinking about some of the ways in which tactics of unmasking have manifested in African context. That's why much of my research is in. And examples that came to mind was in Zimbabwe in 2015 onwards, up to the coup that removed the long-serving leader Mugabe in 2017. There was a lot of unmasking that was used by individuals within the ruling party to attack their political opponents, and they did that very successfully. Someone could be easily accused of being part of the group of people who were trying to stage a coup without any evidence, and then they would be fired or otherwise publicly reviled. And I also thought the same thing about the Rwandan genocide, the use of dehumanizing terms like cockroaches and things like that, that was done over public radio. Now we see some of the manifestations of dehumanizing language here in the United States and how it intertwines with a lot of the social polarization. Now Rwanda is a very maybe extreme case with its genocide, but what's your opinion on the trends of social polarization going on now in the United States? Do you think it can get to an extreme point? And I say this because it also brings to mind the discussion that I was having with some of my colleagues, and they were saying, there's potential for violence if the election doesn't go the way of certain groups of people, which I found quite surprising because elections in the United States have always, there have been some controversial ones, but they've not necessarily been associated with political violence. So do you see those kinds of extreme forms of, political instability happening?
It's very hard to say. Even though I'm a foreigner, I come to America a lot. I come probably about 2 or 3 times a year for the last 15, 16 years and traveled widely, not just on the coastal parts, but in the Midwest and the South and so on. And what strikes me from the conversations, all anecdotal of course, that I have with people who are not intellectuals, is just how abandoned they feel. And Washington, it's a bubble. You can use a different word for it. But, the impeachment, for example, that's going on at the moment, a lot of people will say, I imagine, they've been wanting to impeach him right from the beginning. They were looking for anything to do it. The most dangerous thing, it seems to me, that you can do, and this almost happened in Britain over Brexit, was that you can refuse to accept the electoral legitimacy of the person who is elected. It doesn't matter in this case that Trump got in because of the Electoral College. We all know that if it had been the other way around, Democrats would not be complaining about the Electoral College. They would be singing its virtues. This is a pure matter of political expediency and attack. That creates a lot of cynicism. And cynicism destroys the bonds that any nation must have to actually live together. And in the end, you have to live together. So, I'm not sure about violence, but the language needs to change from everybody. And I'm tackling a small part of it. And part of it is in the academic world that I see and that I've rejected. And then in the broader world, the world of social media, where it seems to be so damaging.
Any other questions? Yes, no.
Yes. Sort of a follow-up maybe on what you're saying. In the historical part of your talk, like the precedents of unmasking, you use examples from the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution in practice of unmasking. I'm thinking about the authoritarian regimes of today, especially in the third world, and their practice of unmasking. To give a more concrete examples about the Turkish government, between 2016 and 2018, they blacklisted and expelled a great portion of the state bureaucracy and civil society, this and that. And not just the Turkish government, other governments too, like, I don't know, I'm thinking of Orban, Brasilia, other places. They do not necessarily justify their politics, what they're doing on the Russian Revolution or on what Nazis did. What they usually cite, I just heard this in an interview the other day, the German unification. A spokesman for the Turkish president was on an interview at Deutsche Welle, and he said that he was asked the question, how did you blacklist and fire so many people without any legal process? And he said that's what you did during the German unification. You fired and expelled 500,000 people.
You mean after the Second World War?
No. With the fall of the wall after 1990.
They expelled 500,000 people.
That's what he claimed. And so they do not necessarily justify, the current practices of, even if you think of American politics today, nobody will justify what they do on the claim that Nazis did the same thing, so we are doing the same here, or we are taking after the Russian Revolution. People usually use other examples, like how would you maybe reflect on this?
Well, I think perhaps at the root of the question is, why did I choose those examples of the French Revolution and the Bolsheviks rather than some others? I mean, for example, why them and not what happened with the Dreyfus case in France, where there was a miscarriage of justice? The reason why I did that is that I wanted to find examples where the term unmasking was used, where it is used by the politicians, where it is used in the newspapers, where it is used in court, and what have you. So that's what directed me towards those two cases, and it wasn't a kind of an arbitrary decision. I was looking. If I were to find other cases where that language was used, for example in Turkish, I would be very interested. But what you're raising, I think, is something very, very big. There are different ways of claiming that people are traitors, of purging people, of renewing an administration often in authoritarian ways. But that's a very, very big area, and it has to do with regime transformation, regime renewal. I'm struggling to find a link between what I've been talking about and that. As fascinating as that is.
Any other questions?
One of the other students, please feel free.
All right. If you don't have any other questions, just leaves me to thank Dr. Baehr for such an excellent presentation and discussion. And I'd like to also thank all of you for going through this very rigorous program. And I hope that you found all the sessions that we had informative and inspiring in some ways. And hopefully the information and the skills and the insights that you've gained from this program will be helpful for you moving forward. So thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Baehr.
Can I just say something before we
Yes.
wind up? Thank you very much for coming. It's pretty exhausting
Yeah.
listening to yet one more speaker drone on, particularly about theoretical issues. But you can find me on my homepage at Lingnan University. If you have other questions or you want to make comments, please do. And I'll be very happy to talk them over. And I always appreciate the corrections. If I'm claiming that by the way we talk, there is a danger of dogmatism here, then one has got to be careful. One doesn't fall into it. It's very, very easy. So I appreciate the questions here. Maybe I'll hear from you. Good luck with your studies.
Thank you.